Though she had visited this world countless times, she had never been pleased by how plain the houses were. They just sat there next to each other like perfect white squares in their perfectly manicured lawns, with their perfectly straight driveways. There were no jagged lines, dead flowers, or a hint of black to be found on any of them. The houses didn't even move. How primitive. The only resemblance this world had to her own was the current darkness and a pleasant mist that hung faintly in the air. She smiled at how grim it felt. "Do you see anything?" she asked the cat. "Not particularly," Elvira said as they walked, staring at each house. "Or, at least not what we're looking for." "I hope no one sees us," Mrs. Macabre said, annoyed. "If we run into another Girl Scout, I swear to Hades." "Wait," Elvira stopped dead in her tracks. "Yes?" Mrs. Macabre perked up a bit. Elvira nodded to her. They both walked towards a house, the damp grass squeaking under their feet as they quietly grew closer. A loud bark came from behind the fence next to the house, making them stop. "Dogs," Elvira hissed, hair standing up. "Why do so many of them have to have dogs?" "Patience, my sweet," Mrs. Macabre reassured her, "they can be easily distracted." She tilted her umbrella up and a piece of straw grew out of the tip of it. She held it between two fingers, gazing at it intensely. The bit of straw slowly turned into a white bone. She threw it over the fence and the dog stopped barking. The thumping of its paws could be heard running across the yard. "Thanks," Elvira sighed. "You're welcome," Mrs. Macabre smiled. "Where are they?" "Up there." Elvira tilted her head towards the second floor of the house. Another black window stared back at them like all the rest. "Ah, yes." Mrs. Macabre moved closer, almost to the front porch. "Come on up, then." She gestured her shoulder to Elvira. The cat hopped on and sat next to her head, with both her hands on the handle of the umbrella. Mrs. Macabre flew upwards. They reached the window and hovered in front of it. From the glow of the moonlight, Mrs. Macabre could see two beds occupied by two girls who looked almost exactly alike. Their room was decorated with fake spider webs and bats. Posters of The Nightmare Before Christmas and other spooky films hung here and there. A collection of horror books were placed neatly on a shelf in the corner. "Oh, I like them very much, indeed," Mrs. Macabre whispered, "but do you think they require our assistance?" Elvira's eyes glowed the color of glow-in-the-dark paint, and stared at the children. "They would do well back home," she said, distracted, as if she was looking for something. Mrs. Macabre nodded in agreement. "They are not liked by others," she continued. "But that's because they possess qualities that more narrow-minded folk do not see." "Is that a yes?" "It is." Elvira's eyes returned to their normal, darker green shade. "Wonderful, then let us," she gasped. "What is it?" Elvira asked. She squinted in the window and saw the clock on their nightstand, glowing with the same green as her eyes had been just moments before. It was 10 minutes till the hour was up. "Blast," Mrs. Macabre said, then quickly flew back down. Elvira jumped off and they went rushing off of the front lawn and into the street. "I told you we should have left the manor earlier." "You're always so," Elvira panted. "Oh, do shut up, darling," Mrs. Macabre said as her umbrella transformed into a broom again. They reached the black area from which they had entered. Elvira had noticed her companion had stopped. "Well," she said impatiently, "come on, then." "You stay here," Mrs. Macabre said. "What?" Elvira said, shocked. "I need you to keep an eye on the children, dear," Mrs. Macabre said, keeping her measured tone. "Why?" "Because we want to be certain that these are the correct children." "But would you care for me to jog your memory on what happened last time?" Mrs. Macabre's face was still as stone and her eyes were as sharp as knives. Elvira knew what that expression meant. She had seen it in her companion's darkest moments. It was an expression of utmost certainty. "Yes," Elvira sighed. "You're right. Good kitty." Mrs. Macabre smiled and scratched Elvira behind her right ear, her favorite spot. "In the meantime, have some dinner." She removed another straw from her broom and tossed it up in the air. By the time it had hit the ground, it had transformed into a mouse. It squeaked at the sight of the cat and ran away. Elvira glared at it with hungry eyes. "Thank you." She looked back up at Mrs. Macabre, who had taken her raven shape again. "But don't do this again." "Nevermore," said the raven, and she flew into the darkness. "Hilarious," Elvira said and ran down the street, looking for the mouse.